Hello and a very warm welcome to this week's edition of The Front Page. It's our last show before Royal Ascot, so we'll be focusing on all things Royal Meeting over the next 30 minutes or so, including asking whether prize money at the meeting is sufficient to retain its place in the global hierarchy, and reflecting on a major spending spree by a rising power in the sport. We'll also be looking at the exit from the Jockey Club of Chief Executive Nevin Truesdale, who'll be leaving his role later in the year. And along the way, we'll tick off a few of the other big stories from the racing world over the last 7 days. For all of that, I'm your host, Tom Kerr, and I'm delighted to be joined in the studio by Maddy Playle. Welcome, Maddy.
Yeah, morning, Tom. Bit grim outside today, wasn't it? But we'll be cheering everyone up with our excellent analysis in here.
It's not very Royal Ascot weather yet, is it? We're hoping for a turn for next week and some proper sunshine. And out in his sprawling estate in East Anglia, Peter Scargill, welcome.
Good morning, sir. My mother told me that the sun shines on the righteous. And as we've begun, the sun has come out. So I'm feeling quite righteous this morning.
Tremendous. What better point then to get cracking? And as already mentioned, we're going to begin today's show by looking at the Royal Meeting and specifically one of the big stories over the last 7 days, which is the question of prize money at Ascot. This all began when Nick Smith spoke to the Racing Post, and Nick Smith, of course, being the international racing scout for Ascot, who travels around the world trying to persuade the great and good to send their star horses to Ascot for mid-June, and he revealed that increasingly over the last few years he and his team have been struggling to persuade those, particularly those travelling the longest distances, to come to Royal Ascot, as the proliferation of higher value targets closer to home have made the relative paucity of riches on offer at Ascot increasingly unattractive. Maddy, there was plenty of follow-up through this week. I thought one of the most striking stories of them all was perhaps Wesley Ward, Mr. Royal Ascot in America, echoing these comments and saying for a lot of his owners, although they're initially enthusiastic about coming over to Ascot, once they've done it, they've spent a huge amount of money, often not got a great result for their money, and there's just no appetite to return. It really does highlight the challenges being faced by Ascot to draw competitors from abroad.
Yeah, exactly. I must admit, I find it quite entertaining the way you sort of stuck the knife in there. There was a bit of patriotism, but it isn't funny, really, because Royal Ascot's going to increasingly struggle to compete on the global stage, I think, especially with the loss of the late Queen. She was a big draw for many people, I think, to come to the event. Obviously now racing has two new great patrons, but it's a different kind of attraction, I suppose. You only have to look at the prize money on offer at Ascot compared to, specifically in the story that we're talking about with Nick Smith, he was referring to a lot of the Japanese and the Hong Kong raiders, for instance, and they're the ones who are less likely to travel. If you compare to the prize money on offer there, it's just not really worth it in any way, shape or form. You take a horse like California Spangle, who's one of the best sprinter milers in Hong Kong. He won the Al-Quoz Sprint in March in Dubai, and there was only very brief mention of Royal Ascot at all. It was never really going to come off. Obviously, I spend a bit of time out in Hong Kong. I know their horses quite well. You look at a horse like Romantic Warrior. He's just won the Yasuda Kinen in Japan. Royal Ascot never really would have been on his radar. And the Japanese increasingly are focusing on the Middle Eastern riches, Dubai, Saudi Arabia, even those smaller meetings in the Middle East, because they are so lucrative and they fit in well with their calendar. Whereas Royal Ascot, I think you need to target it from quite a long way out. We've particularly seen this with the Australian horses in recent years as well. It needs to be on your agenda from some way back in order for that to actually pay off. And we've been so lucky in recent years, haven't we? We had Nature Strip come over and he was unbelievable. And I always think, as an international racing fan, it adds so much dimension and intrigue to a race. And I'd love to see, Japan are the best in the world. So I would love to see more of their horses coming over. We had a couple of Japanese raiders come over maybe in the years of Enable, didn't we? I think Cheval Grand, he came over for a bit. Did Suave Richard come over for something? I'm not sure. But maybe they were sort of testing the waters and they didn't do too well. So now Japan are thinking, well, actually, you know what? We've got the best horses. We've got the best races in terms of prize money. So this is just the latest sign that Royal Ascot can't really live off the prestige and the history and the pomp and ceremony forever when you look at the global racing calendar. Although, saying that, there are people out there who don't really care about the prize money, such as Watnan Racing. And we've seen, and I'm sure we'll talk in a moment about how heavily they invested last week for this, this showcase meeting. And in a way, the prize money can be irrelevant for some people, but for a lot of people, it just doesn't quite make sense to fit in with their programs internationally.
I think one of the really striking things is if nations are successful, you'll often see a sequence of runners coming from those countries over the coming years. And we saw this, of course, with Australia, with the sprinting success they've had. If that success does not materialise or dries up, the appetite to do it diminishes significantly because, as you highlight, there are more lucrative pots at home. So I think people were really enticed by the idea of coming to Ascot and having a winner. That still holds a huge amount of prestige and lustre, and hobnobbing with the great and good in your top hats obviously has a novelty value as well as a sort of a bucket list factor. But if you come over, you don't win, as you say, some of those prizes at home are just so much more enticing, and we'll show on screen this graphic comparing some of Royal Ascot's races to the homegrown targets. But then, as you rightly say, factor in the Middle East as well and the spiralling riches there.
And the season's so long too. I mean, if you're wanting a horse to perform at a couple of these boutique meetings, whether it be the Breeders' Cup or the Dubai World Cup or even the Saudi Cup night, you can't win them all. And that's something I referenced in another view I did during the week with regards to the Guineas and the prize money for the Guineas, and how this global season now is so important to everyone. And I think that has a huge impact. It's not just the money, it's the actual way that the season is planning out and how these races, yes, they've always been important races, but they're growing in importance relative to others.
Pete, the importance of drawing runners from overseas, it's not just about the exoticism and excitement they lend to the meeting. There's a really important sort of financial imperative here for meetings like Royal Ascot to engage and capture an audience around the world who are then going to bet into the pools on the races.
Of course, I mean, that has to be the case. And that's what struck me about Nick Smith's comments about the Far Eastern runners, because obviously the world pool is, British racing's great white hope, isn't it? It's this new income source that racecourses want to grow. And if you have runners from Japan and Hong Kong, given that it's primarily a Hong Kong racing club, powered, organisation or product, you're going to get more people betting into it. So if you can attract those horses, you're going to get more interest and people are going to make more money. So that has to be a financial element to it in that respect. But there's other factors. Wesley Ward's stuff made me sort of smile to some extent, because he's right. I mean, there's a lot of prize money on offer at home, but equally his model of bringing over very fast, hard-trained 2-year-olds to blast out the gates and win has been copied by others. So he's in that classic position of a pioneer, whereby he's gone out, he's found a niche, he's exploited that niche, and then everybody's rushed in after him. So, he is a victim of his own success. If victim's the right word to some extent. And that is the issue with Ascot to some extent. If issue again is the right word, because it is incredibly competitive racing. It's the meeting that everybody increasingly wants to have runners at. It's not quite Cheltenham Festival-esque, but as Maddy referenced, if you look at Watnan Racing, the reason that the Emir of Qatar is buying so many horses to compete there is that is a meeting that he wants to be present at. It used to be, until he sort of stopped coming to races, the meeting that Sheikh Mohammed wanted to have runners at, and it was all about Royal Ascot. So I don't think Ascot are looking to trade on their prestige too much. I think Nick Smith in particular has spoken of the issues that they have, but that prestige still drives people to come to it. So it's a number of things they need to untangle. But yeah, I mean, look, if they get horses particularly in from the Far East, that's going to benefit British racing financially. So I'm sure that is part of the reason it was flagged as an area of concern.
Well, the £1 million question then, Pete, is should British racing be spending its, as we know, very limited funds on bolstering the prize money for these top races, given that it would take several £1 million for the majority of the Group 1s at Royal Ascot to be competitive on an international scale?
Well, I don't think you can scoop away what already exists just to prop up the top. I don't think that's robbing poor Peter to pay rich Paul isn't a way to run a sport, is it? That's not going to work in the long term. I think there's a point that's been flagged up by Tim Husbands at Leopardstown in terms of maybe joining up races, making it more of a campaign. They used to do that. If you go back to the great times of a lot of the Australian sprints coming over, like Takeover Target, and a wonderful story about Takeover Target. The reason he used to come to Royal Ascot so much was that the races at Royal Ascot were part of the Global Sprint Series. So they'd have these sprint races all over the world, and you'd win big bonuses and all of that sort of stuff. So whether joining races up in some kind of either formal or informal arrangement and tempting people in that way is a short-term way to generate interest, because obviously the alternative is if you don't get the interest, you can put the money in and it's still won by the same people. So I think it needs to be more than just sticking a load of money in and saying, come on, lads, let's race over here. There needs to be more strategy to it.
Maddy, let's turn to Wathnan Racing and the Emir of Qatar's major investment in the run-up to this year's Royal Ascot. Just how significant is the arrival on the racing scene in this country and internationally of such a prominent international figure?
It's massive. I mean, you only have to look at last year's meeting. The two horses that I can remember off the top of my head, and they both won, were Gregory and Courage Mon Ami. And Courage Mon Ami winning the Gold Cup. I mean, that was, I'm sure he wasn't a pretty, I'm sure he wasn't a cheap purchase, but that was a pretty shrewd bit of operating there for them to buy him and Gregory, who's going to go into this year's Gold Cup in his absence. It's incredible the sheer volume and speed at which this organisation has just grown up from the ground, and the amount of capital they're investing at the Breeze Up sales, but mainly the interesting part for me is that it's horses in training that they're going after. They're cutting out such a formative stage of a horse's career in a long way. Although they're investing in some ways at the sales, they're actually cherry picking which horses in training they want, and it's something that we saw them do before the ARC meeting in October last year, and there were several significant purchases at that. And again, 6 of them this time around, headed by Hartem, the Irish 2,000 Guineas runner-up. And he's going to have a real cracking chance, obviously, when he lines up in the St James's Palace Stakes. But yeah, I think, as I said before, it proves that, there's not always as much as Courage Mon Ami was a very good purchase. The aim here is not to get your money back. It's not to be a profitable organisation, clearly. It's purely a case of being represented on the biggest stage and winning some of these big races, which they've already shown that they can do. And for racing to have a group, an organisation, whatever you want to call it, investing that much money in such a short amount of time is fascinating, and it's going to be interesting to see how they grow. When I spoke to Richard Brown, who's one of their chief investors, and he manages a lot of the purchasing of these horses, he was kind of lukewarm on whether this would extend into a breeding operation, which I think is fascinating, because when you're buying that many horses in training, many of them mares, I think I spoke to him after they bought Remarquee, is this going to have a sustainable future, and are they going to keep producing their own horses? And he wasn't sure at this stage. So for me, that is a really interesting question, because I almost want to know the end of the cycle of this stock that they're purchasing, and if it is going to prove regenerative in a way. So that I kind of wonder if it's sustainable to do at the current level in the way that it's being done. I mean, we obviously know there's almost endless pots of money there, but yeah, it's great that racing has such significant support, and has been, the fact that it has such significant investment shows that it's still an attractive thing to want to be involved in. But it is almost operating within a vacuum of, well, not everyone can go out and do that, and it's quite a specialist case, very much like ammo racing in a way. Yeah,
we were worried that racing might run out of incredibly wealthy Middle Eastern monarchs, but it turned out that there were more to come at the sport, which is handy. Yes. That is the big question, isn't it? Is Wathnan Racing, is it going to turn into this giant sport straddling operation, perhaps on a scale to at least mimic, if not rival, Godolphin, or is it a smaller scale racing operation, and will it remain something that's there to give an interest and certainly valuable investment in the sport, but not that sort of level where it actually changes the sport itself?
It's hard to know. I mean, I guess it depends on what they want ultimately and what their aims are. We've seen already that they have a new trainer in Newmarket now, a dedicated trainer who's come over from the Middle East. So that certainly is a statement of intent. But yeah, so far their approach has very much been purchase the horses, leave them with whichever trainer they're in. We need probably more evidence of an empire growing there, perhaps. But that will come in time, and we're still talking very short timescales. You know, this time last year they were very, very new on the block. Less so now. They've got a retained jockey on board in James Doyle. That's another thing that speaks in their favour, and the fact that they want to build and progress. So yeah, I guess it just depends.
And Peter, you've been known to trade 1 or 2 horses in your time. I guess the question everyone wants to know is, what sort of cash are they splashing about at these sales? Because they're all private sales. We don't know what the horses have gone for. I'm going to put you on the spot here. What do you reckon their investment in the run-up to Royal Ascot has been?
There's a good question. How many horses they bought? Sort of 8, 10 horses, that sort of region.
What would you put on Hartem, Pete? What, just him alone? How much would you say they would have paid for him?
Okay, well, I know that, for example, the confirmation of Hartem's sale was delayed because the amount that was paid for him had to be paid in so many tranches because it was such a large amount that they had to make sure all the tranches went through. So obviously it was a significant amount in that regards. I mean, he's a 3-year-old colt that's classic placed. I mean, you're going to be pushing up towards, if not easily, over 7 figures, aren't you? I mean, how much do these horses get syndicated for? So, yeah, I mean, it's a big 7-figure layout, isn't it? With Hartem the cornerstone of that. I mean, he's the big poster boy, isn't he? I mean, 3-year-old colts are the most desirable currency when it comes to these big operations.
I've got this great image now of the Emir of Qatar calling up Monzo to try and pass. This is okay. It's a legitimate transfer. I'm just buying some horses.
Do you think
from
he has
Royal
to get
Ascot.
his nationwide card reader out like the rest of us?
Put the little code in, exactly. Yeah. So
I mean, has to be the case, doesn't it? That has to be the case. You know, it's important to make sure that the transactions go through properly and the source of the money is legitimate. So I praise Monzo for their work in this case.
Many, many millions. We will put it at that. One person who's not going to be in action at Ascot apparently is Frankie Dettori. Much to, I think, everyone's surprise, because, well, certainly mine anyways, because when he decided he wasn't retiring last year and he said, but I am done in Britain on that memorable day, Champions Day, I don't think anyone actually believed him.
No. He was, I think, 6-4 by Bet365 to ride at the meeting this year, last year. And I'm surprised, like you, Tom. I still kind of think, is there a possibility he could have a U-turn? I really do.
Really have his saddle with him,
really
just
do.
in case plum ride comes up.
We know that at Ascot, so many spare rides are knocking around. Maybe not as many. You know, Wesley Ward, he's been jockeying up John Velasquez a lot more in recent years. He's been relying on Frankie a bit less, but you know, then you've got the whole John Gosden relationship. John saying earlier this week that he wasn't as happy with his 3-year-old crop as has been the case in previous years. And poor old Kieran Schumacher, well, he's not had the ideal first couple of months in that new role. But yeah, part of me, I'm not ruling it out. I know it's been announced officially that he's going to be there as a race goer. He's not doing any TV appearances, which was bandied around at some point that he would be on ITV and all sorts of different broadcasts. Which is a shame, really, because he clearly has so much to bring to the meeting. It's almost his meeting, isn't it? It's such a big part of the Royal Ascot identity. I just struggle to believe it.
He's been riding brilliantly in America.
He's been riding absolutely fantastically, you know, rocketing in winners left, right and centre. It seems crazy that he would come and attend the meeting and not ride. I'm sure if you asked him, he'd much rather be riding than there as part of a social event, as much as I'm sure he enjoys that too. But
I wonder. One person who, well, I see there could be quite a few people in the weighing room who are probably quite glad if Dettori doesn't ride, because he'd be doing the sort of Piggott job and pinching plum rides. Schumacher, you mentioned, probably one of them.
Yeah.
The Gosdens, obviously, I think are very conscious that they're trying to bring on a new jockey and that this is going to take time for the bed in. Not had the most straightforward of starts, and indeed, as you alluded to there, John Gosden actually talking quite openly about how they've not found their rhythm so far this season. Really makes Royal Ascot very important for them.
It was explosive a couple of years ago, wasn't it, when he gave Frankie that public dressing down. So, yeah, pressure's going to be on for Kieran Schumacher now. And early on, too, we've obviously got Inspiral, who's the big one in the Queen Anne, the very first race. And John said after the lock-in to us, she wasn't fit. We were really happy with her run, of course, when she was beaten by a stablemate audience. I get the intention this is going to be no excuses territory now for horse and rider. And then the big rides just keep on coming throughout the week. So I do feel a bit sorry for Kieran Schumacher. It's clear he's not quite had the firepower that the Gosdens have had in previous years. Maybe they've been trained slightly differently, or they've just come to hand a lot later. But yeah, it's a huge week. The pressure is on, as we know. Jockeys are under the spotlight. They're under a lot of strain. And yeah, it would be interesting to see who comes out on top in some of those really big skirmishes, because there are a couple of races that I'm really looking forward to.
We're going to come back to the big races just in a minute. Pete, I just want to bring in you very quickly on one of the perennial themes of Royal Ascot, which is of course that royal connection. Last year, the King really embraced the meeting. He got a fantastic reception, and I think a lot of people in racing regarded that as a quite seismic moment in terms of the handover from the late Queen to King Charles. Of course, King Charles been treated for cancer this year. They never confirm attendance one way or another before an event anyways. It's simply royal protocols, but we don't know, obviously, whether he will be at Ascot, and if so, for how many days. I guess it's very important for the meeting. Would have helped perhaps if they had a slightly stronger team. I was at Epsom when Treasure run, and everyone's sort of saying, well, let's hope we get a good performance here, because that will lead straight into Royal Ascot, and of course that did not materialise. But what do we anticipate for the week, and how important is it for Ascot to have that royal connection?
Well, Ascot trades on having a royal connection. It's Royal Ascot, it's the Royal Racecourse. I mean, we had the Queen for so many years, the late Queen for so many years, and as Maddy referenced earlier, a lot of people wanted to be at Ascot to meet the Queen if they're in that position, or to see the Queen. It's an opportunity for people to get up close and engage in a bit of nostalgia, a bit of national pride, all that sort of stuff that comes with it. So the fact that the King and the Queen were there last year and had the success with Desert Hero was positive to see in that regards, and the fact that they were at Epsom this year is positive in that regards, and the fact that they have increased their links with racing through becoming joint patrons of the Jockey Club is positive in that regards. There's the King Charles III Stakes this year, the old King Stand Stakes. So you would probably bet your money that if he's going to be at Royal Ascot, considering his ongoing treatment, that is likely. Start of the week, King Charles III Stakes. That seems a pretty good bet. For the rest of the week, I suppose it depends on how his treatment is going, and the other royals who may be attending. But having a royal presence at the meeting during the week is always vital for Royal Ascot, because otherwise it's kind of just Ascot, isn't it?
Wow, kind of just Ascot. That's a big statement. Let's not forget, Pete, that it is, at the end of it, home to some of the best racing in the world, our premier flat carnival, and there's some great races coming up next week. What contest are you most looking forward to?
I always look forward to the 2-year-old races. 2-year-old races are my thing. I enjoy them greatly. So all of the 2-year-old races. Is that unspecific enough for you?
That's okay. That's fine. It's horses for courses, Pete. How about you, Maddy?
Thanks,
what are you
man.
looking forward to?
I was about to go in straight with a negative there, true to style. I'm really looking forward to the Commonwealth Cup.
Okay.
A sprint, I've got monetary interest there. The only bet I've had for Royal Ascot Antipost this year was in just saw for the race. But I think it's a really strong contest. You've had Inisherin, who won the Sandy Lane so impressively, who brings the Guineas form into question. Van Dijk, of course, the superstar from last year. Elite Status looked really good. I think the older horse sprints are quite weak this year, both the 5 furlong and 6 furlong races. I've not been bowled over by looking at them anti-post, but the Commonwealth Cup looks great. Want to see Continuous back in the Hardwick, last year's St Ledger winner. I think he could be a middle distance star. Coronation Stakes is looking pretty warm as well. You've got Opera Singer, El Malka, Fallen Angel, etc. So those are the couple of races that I'm really looking forward to.
Brilliant. Thanks, Maddy. Yeah, a host of great action coming up at Ascot next week. We'll obviously be covering every scrap of action extensively across all the usual Racing Post channels, and indeed on the Racing Post YouTube channel. We'll have all your favourite shows, previewing the action and serving up some excellent tipping advice in advance of the big meeting. We'll be back in just a second after this short commercial break. Hello and welcome back. We're now going to move on to the news last week that Jockey Club Chief Executive Nevin Truesdale is to leave his role before the end of the year. Truesdale took over the role in 2020 and saw the Jockey Club through the latter stages of the COVID pandemic, but since then he has faced a host of headwinds, including the cost of living crisis, declining crowds, financial troubles, internal unrest, and of course our old friend affordability checks. Maddy, Truesdale's exit, I don't think it came as a massive surprise. We ran a big piece about 6 weeks ago looking at that internal unrest and revealing that within the Jockey Club membership there were some people who were very unhappy with the direction of travel. So not a big surprise, but how do we assess Truesdale's reign at the top of the Jockey Club?
Yeah, it's difficult to do, but the number one thing for me when looking at this story is just the sheer amount of challenges he's had to face in such a short amount of time. You mentioned some of them there, came into the role at the tail end of the coronavirus pandemic, that had huge implications on the sport. Nevin himself set up the affordability petition, which did gain the requisite 1,000 signatures. 100,000, sorry. And then we had the falling attendances. You mentioned the rising costs of everything. We had our good friends Animal Rising presenting all sorts of problems for him at the Grand National in the Derby, and lots of other places as well. So for me, this is just a catalogue of really challenging things that the Jockey Club and Nevin had to face and tackle, all in an environment where, we are in a cost of living crisis, the prices of everything is going up. The Cheltenham Festival, for instance, is the Jockey Club's biggest asset, and changes have been going on there.
Of course, they had to, after this year's festival turned out to have smaller crowds than anticipated, they obviously had to cut prize money subsequently, which was pretty seismic because the Jockey Club is normally associated with being the last to cut prize money if it can avoid it. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, it's a worrying time for British Racing's premier jump event, I guess, on that front. It just shows you some of the challenges economically that are facing that sort of commercial venture. So yeah, from my perspective, I think it's clearly been an incredibly challenging time. How he's performed, I think, is incredibly difficult for me to say and for me to have a view on. But I can recognise that it was definitely a very tricky situation for him to be put into with all these different headwinds facing the Jockey Club.
Yeah, when you list them, it really becomes incredibly clear just how challenging it was, Pete. Let's look at the areas that I think you can fairly say that Truesdale played a very good hand. The Animal Rising protesters, who obviously caused enormous disruption at Aintree last year, then targeted Epsom, and everyone sort of looked at Epsom and thought, my God, this is going to be carnage, because the unique layout of the track and the unique circumstances of the Browns' ownership just meant that defending Epsom seemed borderline impossible. But Truesdale went out, he got an injunction against protesters, worked closely with police, and a single protester got on the track, didn't hold up the race at all, and since then Animal Rising has no longer been a factor. It's easy, I think, to forget just how differently this could have gone.
For sure, it was proper assertive action. I suspect with Aintree, it was a larger, more dynamic protest than perhaps they'd even anticipated. There was a lot of talk and sabre rattling in the run-up to it, but then, with people jumping on the course and at the fences and what have you. They had to act. The Grand National was delayed by nearly quarter of an hour. There were subsequent issues, perhaps around Hill 16, who died having got worked up before running in the race. They couldn't not do anything. And like you said, I mean, Animal Rising said, we're going to go to Epsom, we're going to stop the derby. They had all these meetings beforehand where both sides, couldn't agree. And the Jockey Club had to go out and had to get something done. And they did. There was fencing everywhere. There was so many security I've never seen. And, they worked with police. There was a big arrest before the meeting took place to knock out quite a lot of the protesters. And, on top of that, Nevin Truesdale has been an excellent communicator, particularly around the Grand National, which is always a flashpoint in terms of horse welfare and what the sport, how it presents itself to the general public. And Nevin has come on for the last couple of years and been a very good communicator in terms of, this is what we're doing, this is what we've changed, this is what we're not changing, and explaining why he's been excellent at that. So you have to give him credit for that. And in terms of, as you mentioned, rallying support around the petition that led to the Westminster Hall debate and affordability checks, and having to deal with difficult. I mean, he came in at a very difficult time following the departure of Delia Bushell, and he's had to steer through a number of crises. So, whilst Rosie the Jockey Club now, and whilst it's been difficult, particularly for the last two Cheltenham festivals, he's proved himself to be a very stable, solid, and capable chief executive.
And I think that if we look forward then and we consider the challenges that the next chief executive is going to have to tackle, many of them are the ones that Truesdale found more challenging. It's around prize money, it's around attendances, it's around the actual structure and direction of the sport. And of course we've had the sort of semi-abortive Premier Racing experiment which was supposed to address that. That's really the great challenge that faces the incoming chief executive. How do you deal with these big fundamental structural questions about the sport, which are then having a really significant economic impact on the ability to fund investment in prize money and facilities and marketing and everything else that a successful sport requires?
Exactly. And as chief executive of the Jockey Club, you've got no hiding place. You are, as Paul Fisher said to me in an article I did last week, you are seen as one of the leaders of British racing when you're the chief executive of the Jockey Club. You're not running an independent racecourse. You're not one of the smaller operators. You are there front and centre as a major operator. So, I spent quite a lot of last week after the announcement came through that Nevin would be stepping down later in the year, trying to speak with as many members of the Jockey Club or people who are associated with it as possible. Now, quite a lot of people didn't want to speak about it, but those who did on and off the record offered a whole suite of different things that need to be changed in their minds, going from how the race program is, how the operation deals with its media rights, how it engages with young people, how it structures, how it doesn't work. Like you said, the structure between centralisation and local courses and different functions that should be carried out in different places. By all accounts, the membership unrest, whilst it was talked about, was less of a factor in the decision for Nevin Truesdale to depart. But still, listening to these people and taking on their views and working into what's going on, and the fact you've got a new senior steward coming in Baroness Harding after the July meeting. I mean, there's a hell of a lot of things to throw in together. So whoever comes in needs to be quite dynamic. I think they almost certainly have to have some sort of experience within racing or a good knowledge of racing, because sort of coming in with all of that stuff going on and not knowing is like being given like a time bomb, isn't it, basically? So whoever comes in needs to be quite a strong character, but they need to be able to work with people and help push the Jockey Club forward, particularly in this leadership role, because they're not going to be given too much time to sort of get their feet on the table, I don't feel.
And have you heard any names been put forward by members or the type of individual they'd like to see?
Names, no. I've not had any specific names, and no one recommended me for the role when I was speaking with them either. And then in terms of the person, they wanted a good communicator. They wanted someone with experience of racing or a good knowledge of racing, because obviously you've had two different types of chief executive the last few times. Delia Bushell came in from outside the sport, then Nevin Truesdale, who was promoted from within the Jockey Club, albeit with an experience outside the sport to begin with. Someone who is good at marketing and sort of selling the vision, that sort of thing as well. So, I mean, is someone with a very wide and broad skill set, which I suppose you would expect.
It sounds a tricky one, frankly, Pete,
Yeah,
because you
it
are,
is.
as you say, there is this desire for someone to understand the sport, but equally for them to be all singing, all dancing, modern chief executive who gets all of these sort of complex business and media rights relationships and understands how the financial levers that the Jockey Club has at its disposal can be deployed. Very challenging, almost looking for a unicorn.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you would have conversation with people as well, I'm sure, since last week, and I don't know whether you've been given different indicators to what I have. But yeah, I mean, so whoever comes in, there's a lot expected of them.
The only thing I'll say is I've spoken to a few people who are near the head of a couple of betting markets on the next Jockey Club chief executive, who gave answers along the lines of, you couldn't pay me enough money to do it. So we will see. We're going to leave that there. We will keep on top of this story as the year unfolds and as we get closer to Truesdale's departure and understanding who's going to come in and take up that role, which of course, as Peter and Maddy have said, is so fundamental to the direction of the sport in Britain. We will be back in just a minute after another very short commercial break. Hello again. We are now going to touch on our last story for this week, which is looking at the reaction to a very thought-provoking column that was in Friday's Racing Post newspaper. Chris Cook wrote that he wanted to see more action taken to ensure that horses spend time in the parade ring and pre-parade ring. As someone who enjoys and thinks, probably wrongly, frankly, that they have a bit of insight into conformation, stride, etc. I couldn't agree more. Pete, what do you think about this? It's got a very strong reaction from readers and from many people in the industry as well, backing this call to ensure that the horses spend time in the parade and pre-parade.
Yeah, I'm conflicted, Tom, because I agree with you too, and with what Chris wrote to some extent. I like seeing the horses in the paddock. When I go racing with my wife, she's a big fan of seeing horses in the paddock, and she's quite shrewd as well. She's very good at picking horses out in terms of their demeanour and how they're looking and all of that sort of stuff. And I do feel it adds both to the race day experience, and it can help if you're experienced enough of looking at the horses, determine what you're doing on the day. So, for example, and I appreciate this is after the fact, but if you'd have seen City of Troy in the paddock before the Guineas and City of Troy in the paddock before the Derby, you'd be much happier backing him in the Derby than you would in the Guineas. He looked a much better horse on the day at Epsom. But at the same time, I mean, does it make that big a difference to a great number of people? I mean, the people who it affects are upset about it, but I suspect not a huge number of people are bothered by it immensely.
Isn't it the people who are upset about it, Pete, are the core audience, like the hardcore who really get all these different aspects of the sport and want to have that full spectrum experience?
For sure, and I think that probably is the baseline of it. It's the customers, if the horrible term in the sense because they're racegoers and fans and what have you, but those customers coming to the racecourse who don't feel they're getting what they should be out of it. That's probably the bottom line, and it feeds into the general malaise and the general feeling that people don't feel that they're getting, return for their day at the races or their reason for going racing. So there's a lot of pressure on trainers, jockeys weighing out all that sort of stuff. It's not always easy to do, and it can upset some horses being saddled in the pre-parade ring, for example, and trainers choose to saddle them in the stables. And when it's cold and horrible during the all weather, for example, in the winter, it's nice to be saddled in the stables. So I do think you could bring the horse into the paddock a bit more. You could make more of a deal of it. I'm surprised it hasn't kind of been done. I don't really see why there needs to be a work stream getting it sorted out. You can just do it. But I don't know. It's something that clearly bothers people, but in the grand scheme of things, bothered by other things more.
Maddy, Pete's out of touch with racegoers, isn't he?
A little bit. Pete's sort of singing from the same hymn sheet as Jamie Osborne was on Look on Sunday yesterday, and he was sort of saying, I think this is being over-egged and there's more important things to be worrying about. And there is, but at the same time, I don't really like that view, because I don't know whether it's, maybe you'd have a bit more of a view on this, Tom, but is it because it's changed over time in that people used to be able to get a lot more bang for their buck seeing horses at the races, whether that be in the pre-parade and then the parade, whereas now have we migrated from that sort of era now to where trainers will just stick a hood on a horse to keep it calm or saddle it in the stables to avoid it getting out into those saddling boxes that can be quite daunting for some horses. Is it easier now to not do what you're in theory obliged to do, which should be, you know, make your horse visible to the public, because it is a key part of the race day experience. You know, I don't know many people who would go racing and not want to look at horses in the paddock before a race.
Yeah.
You know, that's how you make your judgments. It's also quite an interesting part of the day in order to see connections and their reaction to the horses. And as Pete mentioned with City of Troy, you know, follow horses throughout the season. How are they developing? How are they progressing? And for me, it's a big part of the race day experience. And for a lot of race goers that I speak to, a lot of friends that I have in the industry, it is for them too. So I think people are naturally going to feel irate when they feel like they're being shortchanged or they're not being respected enough. And it's quite an easy solution, isn't it? Just encourage trainers to do their duty to the public.
Just make it a rule. My view on this is there's not actually that many reasons why someone who really cares about racing would now go racing rather than watching on TV. TV coverage has become so extensive, so high quality in much of the cases, that you don't actually get that much more by going racing, because
totally agree.
You don't get the analysis. It's often quite hard just to follow the racing. Small screens, dodgy tannoys. So one of the few areas that you definitely get something over and above what's offered on TV is you can spend as much time as you want following the horses through the pre-parade and into the parade ring, and really derive insights and enjoyment from that process that you would not be able to do at home when you have, maybe if you're lucky, a sort of very quick whiz through the horses in the parade. So if you take that away, then what reason is there for a really enthusiastic aficionado of horse racing to go racing other than the day out, which is obviously lovely, but from a sporting perspective, it's not very satisfactory.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like I said, I think this is probably, it's changed, and that's what people don't like. It's the fact that they once had better access to something and it's slowly being taken away from them, perhaps, that's making people angry, which I totally understand. You know, there's few nicer things to do if I go to my local track than be by the pre-parade ring. Not too many people there, so you would argue not too many people hold the same view. But when you're sat in a shaded pre-parade ring and a horse will come around with its groom and they'll have a nice interaction, you can see the manner of the horse, the conformation, you know, what sort of form it's in, how fit it is. It doesn't get better than that, really. I think that's a big draw to why I certainly go racing, and I appreciate I'm probably speaking in the minority there, but I can certainly relate to the concerns of people who love the sport and who want to engage with it in that way.
Brilliant. Show us the horses. That's the message from the Racing Post studio. That's all we've got time for this week, but a huge thanks to my panellists, Maddy Playle and Peter Scargill. On the front page this week, I'm going to put Nevin Truesdale and the Jockey Club. Yes, Royal Ascot's next week. Yes, it's a huge story, but there's plenty of time for that. And the departure of a chief executive from racing's biggest racecourse group is enormously important. Truesdale deserves enormous credit for the courage to put his head above the parapet and be the face of the sport's fight back against affordability checks. And if that is his legacy as chief executive, it is a pretty strong one. That's all the time we have this week. I'm going to leave you with a shout out for our Euro 2024 betting guide. I haven't checked to see what they make of Scotland's chances of getting out of the Euros just yet, but I'm looking forward to pursuing it front to back later on today. It is in today's Racing Post, free inside, so get out to the shops and get a copy. But if for whatever reason you're not able to, we are selling it in our shop as well, and we'll put a link to that in the description. That's all for this week, so thanks again to my panellists. Thank you to you at home for tuning in, and we will see you again very soon. Goodbye.